Welcome to Good Grief. I'm Megan Keller. I am studying Marriage and Family Studies at Brigham Young University, Idaho. And my career goal is to become a family counselor or a marriage counselor.
Sweet. Yeah. And I am Ariel Nelson, currently eating trail mix.
Yeah.
No, but I'm a student here at Brigham Young University, Idaho, currently studying marriage and family studies. And I also had the vision of going into counseling. And just a little bit about me. I am the oldest of 7 kids. And I come from I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so I come from the culture where, we're known for families that have a lot of children. But today we're specifically going to be talking about infertility. So I guess the lack of children or the lack of ability to have children. And the reason why we wanted to talk about it today was to kind of allow people to have the chance to feel more accepted or hopefully share awareness towards the topic of infertility and miscarriages, and just make it more normal and normalize the grief that is behind it, because it comes with a lot of sadness. And we'll be going into that today.
Yeah, because this is definitely something that is very personal, and I mean, there is a lot of research out there that just says pregnancy is different for every person, and that's the same with infertility and miscarriage. It is just very individualized, and it is a really sad thing. And I think that's probably the most common aspect of infertility and miscarriage is that it is a grieving process, and it is a hard thing to go through.
Yeah, so there are 4 specific questions that we'll be addressing in this podcast today. So what is infertility? What is miscarriage? How does infertility affect the family system? And how do you cope with infertility? And so we'll be answering those questions today. So, Megan, what is infertility?
Well, according to the definition that we found, it's according to the World Health Organization. It says infertility is the inability to achieve pregnancy or carry a pregnancy to a live birth after 1 year of unprotected sexual intercourse for women of reproductive age. So it's, pretty simply stated that it's the inability to get pregnant, especially after 1 year of trying to conceive.
And before we started this podcast, we were actually talking about how there was another definition of infertility we thought was really interesting. If you wanted to go into that, basically.
There was something, it was I think it was like John Hopkins Hospital or something, and it talked about how infertility is, it's for women that are over the age of 35, infertility is after 6 months of trying. But for women under 35, it's after 1 year of trying. So I thought that was interesting that age really does make a difference in your fertility and just your ability to conceive at all, or even the rate at which you do conceive.
Yeah, so if you guys have any input or answers as to why after only 6 months women are considered infertile at 55 years of age, but after a year or so women that are under the age of 35 are considered infertile. If you guys have any answers for that, please leave a comment down below and give us some more information.
Yeah. To know. We did do research on infertility, but mostly the grief of infertility, so we would love to hear, and I'm sure other listeners would love to read about or understand further why it does happen and why there is a lot of infertility in our world today. Along with infertility, we're going to talk about miscarriage. And the definition for miscarriage is a spontaneous pregnancy loss of a fetus before 20 weeks of gestation. And that's according to the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So, and that is also just a really difficult thing. Obviously, it's related, like, in our next episode, we're going to talk about death, grief related to death. But we felt like this was going to be appropriate for today's episode, since we are talking about babies and just that whole fertility process.
Yeah, so in our last couple of podcasts, we've talked about grief, and we kind of just wanted to recap on what grief is. So grief is basically associated with psychological stress, poor health, and an increased risk of mortality, depression, or drug consumption, which often implies a need for psychiatric intervention or medical help. And I think we don't recognize just how many people do grieve in everyday situations. Grief, is associated with loss. So if you lose something, whether that's someone or something, some connection, some relationship, some material thing, you can grieve in those situations. And that's why we're talking about it today. It is so normal. It is, it happens so much, yet I don't think we necessarily put an emphasis on what might people be feeling in different situations, and how it does affect people's relationships and their way of life. So yeah.
Well, and I mean, like, loss happens more frequently than I think we recognize, like this morning I lost my gloves, and it was freezing and like rain. It's raining today, and I didn't have my gloves. I was walking to school today, and that in and of itself was a grieving process. Like that, I had to deal with those consequences, and I had to deal with that loss. And so, and obviously that's kind of a minor loss.
Yeah, we can laugh at those situations.
Yeah, but there's a whole spectrum, like a whole scale of loss that we need to address, and we need to kind of understand in order to address it.
Especially because it can cause such poor health in individuals. It can have such an effect on, like I said before, their way of life and how they go about things and how they address situations. I remember when, so recently, actually, my grandpa, he had a seizure a couple days ago, and just the idea of losing him causes so much pain and anguish, and he's not even lost. I'm already grieving with just the thought of him being lost. And for the women and men out there who are trying to have a child and who have that hope of having a child, when they see that positive pregnancy test and then figuring out that that child is no longer there, I can't imagine just how much grief there is behind that, knowing that for sure that you did lose something that meant so much to you, especially when you were trying for one.
Yeah. And just like that loss of potential, I guess, because there is so much hope for new life and planning, and there's just so much that goes into planning to have a baby. I mean, especially there are couples that are, they kind of go through this process of, okay, am I ready to have kids? And then they are ready to have kids, so they start trying and trying and trying and trying, and then it's becomes a lot more frustrating because they went through this whole process before of trying to feel prepared and ready, and now it's like, okay, what was the point of that if I can't even reap those blessings?
Yeah. So like going back to like, why do people grieve that we've talked about in our last episodes? We grieve because the meanings that we attach to our behavior are mediated by our own personal agendas and priorities. And when we accept that we are ready to be a mother or a father, and then that can't happen, the meaning that you attach to being a mother or father, which is to have kids, and then you're no longer able to have kids, that is why you grieve, because that meaning, that importance, that priority that you put on yourself, on your identity, it's just you're no longer able to do that. You no longer have the ability, and that's labeled with infertility, that is labeled with a miscarriage. You are unable to do something, and that's hard. That it takes a toll on yourself, your ego, your confidence. Now, because you feel like aren't able to accomplish one thing that is so important to you, how are you able to accomplish those smaller things? And I think that's what goes through people's head when they do find out that they can't have a child, or that it's going to be a lot harder to have a child than other people.
And this definitely goes along with our last episode. Well, not our last episode, like 1 or 2 episodes ago, when we talked about disability grief and how there is this ambiguous loss where there's not really any closure to what you're feeling. And so therefore you just grieve, or almost you don't want to grieve because there is no closure. And it's just so ambiguous, which makes it so much more difficult to feel the feelings that you are feeling, because it is ambiguous. There's not really any tangible, like, I don't know if like that's ever going to happen for me, or I know it's not going to happen for me, but so what's next? Because I feel like I don't have a meaning or a purpose besides having children. And so what now? And there's almost this ambiguous loss of identity that's attached to infertile, or just being infertile, or even having a miscarriage.
Yeah. And it's such a long process too. I mean, we literally talked about like how it literally takes doctors at least a year to even diagnose you with infertility. Mm-hmm. So you're trying every single month for, specifically probably for an entire week for women, to have a child. 12 months,
that's 12 weeks of trying.
Yeah, it's 12 weeks of trying.
Even more so even more weeks of just waiting, like there's this period of just, I think it's called the 2-week waits, where women just have to wait and see until their period starts, and then they have to try again. And so then it's just this whole nother cycle of
ups and downs, and that takes a toll on your emotions. Your emotions have a huge effect on your health, which might, the stress on your body might make it harder for you to have a child. And so it's literally this just entire cycle. And then after a year, you get told, oh, you might not be able to have a child.
Like, it's just so frustrating.
That is so frustrating.
Oh my goodness.
And it hurts, know. You have this hope and this idea and expectation that you will be a mom or you will be a dad. And then you find out that your body is not sufficient to have a child, or your body doesn't produce the means to carry a child or even produce a child. And it's like, is something wrong with me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Am I the reason why I can't do what I wanted to do? I literally can't change that. And that's hard. I mean, I feel like as human beings, our biggest trial is to overcome the fact that we need to accept that we can't change or control certain things, and that's one of them. And that is one of the biggest, hardest things that you can even accept, especially in our culture with, how families, we know that, I mean, I guess we have this, what's the word? Families are they're just big. Mormon families are big, that's just even though it's probably, I mean, nowadays it's not as true, but I mean, I still think that if, in our culture, you were to find out that you can't have a child, it's like, whoa,
Like,
What?
what do I,
Yeah.
how do I function?
Right.
And how do I figure this out? And it can become really toxic, especially if you don't handle it the right way. If you're not able to have that sense of identity for yourself, it can be really detrimental. But I mean, that's kind of why we're talking about it today, because we do want to talk about coping mechanisms and like how we can talk about it in a way that's not going to be detrimental to your family or to you emotionally.
Yeah. So going along with like the idea that being diagnosed with infertility, it takes a year, usually typically after a year, they'll say, okay, maybe we can try going into more fertility treatments. So like IVF. And based off of research, we found that women who remain childless after unsuccessful IVF reported higher rates of depression and stress and lower levels of self-esteem and life satisfaction.
Which is a really sad and depressing statistic that we found. But I mean, it's just to heighten that perspective that this is a real thing and people just don't talk about it because in some aspects it's just embarrassing, and it shouldn't be embarrassing. This is normal. Like, this happens to a lot of women, and there are very strong impacts on women especially, but also in men. Another thing we found was additional impacts of miscarriage on the couple relationship include reduced sexual satisfaction, avoidance of sexual intimacy, and decreased desire. And that affects, I mean, your marriage, which then kind of affects society. And it can, I mean, there's so many aspects that this plays into, and there's so many aspects of grief that just need to be talked about in order for this grief not to be blown up in a way that's going to destroy your marriage or destroy other relationships just because you're not talking about it.
Yeah. But something that I've learned is that when you can address the stressors in your life, including, lower sexual intimacy within your marriage, or possibly, lack of funds to go to fertility treatments. Once you can identify those stressors, you can realize, okay, if I view those stressors in a different way, if I have a different perspective regarding those stressors, that can affect the crisis that happens in your life. You can now view infertility as maybe a more positive thing, as like, okay, well, this gives me the opportunity to maybe focus on my job a little bit more. Maybe I can earn some more money. What are some ways that I can grow my relationships within my workplace? Or what was the other stressor that I named? It was money and sexual intimacy. Maybe I can focus more on, going on dates with my husband, recognizing the reason why I fell in love with him, or going on dates with my wife, depending on who's listening to this podcast. If you look at your stressors in a different light, you might be able to advance your life in a positive light, regardless of such a hard trial.
Well, and even this can be a really good opportunity for you to focus on your health. You're going to the doctors and figuring out things about your fertility. Maybe it's time to kick your body into gear and get it to a point that it is healthy and stronger in other places. Focus on your strengths and what you are able to accomplish, and focus on that part of your self-identity, because there are so many women that go through this and are right with you. If you're listening and you're going through this, there's so many women that are going through this right with you. A statistic we found was, it says current estimates indicate that about 15% to 20% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, defined as the spontaneous pregnancy, loss of a fetus before 20 weeks of gestation. Another statistic we found was over 12% of women aged 15 to 44 have impaired fecundity. It's another word for fertility, a percentage that equates to over 7 million women. Most causes of female infertility include problems with ovulation, obstruction of the fallopian tubes, or abnormal physical characteristics of the uterus. So, I mean, 7 million women on average,
that's a lot.
That's a lot.
And that's only what we know, what is statistically like shown, you know.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think women might not even know that they are infertile or that they miscarried, you know, and that's even more numbers. So, and you know, there's parts of the world where they don't have that technology, where they don't talk about those things. And so this is literally just about the people that have talked and who have gone to the doctors about this information, not including all those who have miscarried and haven't talked about it, or who just haven't been able to have a baby, or maybe who didn't even try to have a baby, you know, and didn't know that they were infertile in the first place. So there's just so many women that have, you know, the same issue. And yeah, it's just, it's a thing. It's a thing.
So and I know especially for women, there's this comparison game, and you try to compare your infertility with someone else's or whatever. I mean, just anything. Women are very good at comparing themselves
That's
to
true.
other women,
Yeah.
Which is not good. It's not a good strength. And this is just another aspect where, like, you need to remember, this is very individual. You are an individual with a certain trial that you're going through, and you are definitely the only one that truly understands your own infertility struggles. But at the same time, you can find that strength in knowing that other women are doing that too. They are going through their own individual infertility or miscarriage trial, and it won't get better, but you will be stronger because you're going through it.
Yeah.
This is a good case study that you found.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good story about comparison.
Yeah. So basically there's this case study, and the names are changed to keep it anonymous, but this is a true story about an individual who is experiencing or has experienced infertility in her life. And so I kind of wrote a summary of the case study because it's just it goes into so much depth. It goes into how it, like, down to the heart and the core, how it affected her and her emotions, how it affected her husband's emotions and their way of life. And so I just summarized it into 3 very big paragraphs. And I thought that I would read it aloud to you guys so that you can get a better understanding of that this does happen. So I'll just start it out. And this is based off of a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, just so that you guys can get a better understanding of who this is and her culture. So a set of LDS fraternal twins, Karen and Michelle, grew up together as best friends. As they got older and spent some time in college, Karen felt the spiritual prompting to serve a mission, while Michelle did not. Karen shared her amazing experiences with Michelle, which left her feeling a little bit left out. However, as Michelle continued going to school, she later met a boy named Sam and eventually got married a couple of months before Karen arrived home from her mission. After Michelle had graduated college, she had the choice to attend veterinary school or put off her dream to fulfill her other desires of becoming a mother. As Michelle supported Sam in graduating college, the couple tried for several months to conceive. However, nothing came about it. Eventually, Michelle became very discouraged, and Karen had taken this offsetting behavior as offensive, thinking that Michelle did not support Karen and her new boyfriend's relationship. They were able to communicate their feelings effectively and had a better understanding of the situation. So basically, after Michelle and Karen had that little misunderstanding, they talked it through as best friends would and were able to solve it. Mm-hmm. So Within a 5-year period, Michelle and Sam were unable to conceive, and Karen and her now new husband were able to conceive 2 children within the span of 18 months. Both Sam and Michelle were devastated, regardless of the happy news of their family members. Their despair led them to make decisions that went against their moral beliefs, such as skipping church or family functions, because the pain was just too much to bear. Michelle and Sam had found out that they were pregnant, but after a week, so they visited the doctors probably 3 times within this week. So after a week, the baby did not have a heartbeat, and so they miscarried. Sam eventually communicated to Michelle that he wanted to take a break from fertility treatments and focus on just living their lives together. Michelle took this as Sam moving on from their pains and avoiding the grief that they were both experiencing at the time. After feeling utterly alone and drained, Michelle had received a call from Karen explaining that she was going to be visiting for a short while. During this visit, Michelle and Karen were able to talk on a deep level that only siblings could do. Michelle broke down and vented all of her feelings she had been experiencing for the last several years, and Karen did the same thing. Michelle realized how blessed she was to have someone so close to her where she could completely share her feelings of pain and heartache regarding her and Sam's infertility journey. After the visit, Michelle felt a peace that she hadn't felt in a long time, and she basically thanked God for placing her sister and her husband in her life. And she knew that she, not immediately, but would one day feel whole again. And so this kind of goes into, at least in the very beginning of the story, I think it relates to a lot of women that are experiencing infertility. They might know someone in their family who is able to have a child and they cannot. And no matter how much they try or no matter how much they hope that they'll have a child, it just won't happen, And so like Megan was explaining, you're constantly comparing yourself to those around you, those that you love and those that you look up to, and you can't meet that expectation. Mm-hmm. And that's just really difficult.
Yeah, it can be hard to see, especially in this case study. They were twins, Yeah. They were fraternal twins, but still, they have always had this sort of comparison of certain things. And so growing up, with this different fertility spectrum, I can only imagine what sort of grief that took and what sort of emotions that had on each other. And even like the husband of, I think, Michelle.
Yeah.
That, it totally affects not only women, but men too. Obviously, I think women are definitely better at playing the comparison game, but it does affect men. Like men are definitely, especially if it's like a low sperm count or like maybe it is something that their body is responsible for, they take it all on them.
Yeah.
And then it's difficult for them to process, and it can affect their identity, and just the same thing.
Yeah.
For women.
And I forgot to mention in this case study, but Sam did go to the doctors and he was diagnosed with low sperm count. And so I can't imagine just how much that affects your self-concept, how much that affects your idea of who you are, what your identity is. Now no longer are you Sam, but now you're Sam with a low sperm count, at least that's what would go on in my mind. If, I was diagnosed with infertility, I'd be like, no longer Ariel, I'd be Ariel with, infertility. Like that affects my personal image of myself. And so like, I just, knowing that I am no longer capable of doing something that would affect me, and then that would affect how I interact with my husband, now I'm like, no longer, I would think he doesn't love me. Like, there's no way he could love me. He married me because he thought that we could have kids and start a family together, but we can't. And so now I no longer want to have that personal relationship with him because he doesn't want to have that personal relationship with me, even though he probably didn't say or do anything like that. That's just based off of my thought process, my grieving, when you're experiencing such strong emotions, that completely changes your thoughts, and those thoughts change your actions. And which is why this is so crazy, and it's so hard. It's so difficult to go about the situation in a positive light when it affects you so much.
Yeah, I think you have this picture in your head of who you are, or even like who your spouse is, and for other people. And so when you start to see that picture change, or it doesn't match reality, and honestly, our mental picture never really matches reality. That can be really hard to accept. And like we're talking about, when you start to have this picture in your head of, oh, my spouse hates me because I have this, I'm not able to do this, or I'm not able to carry a child full term, that can be really, really just toxic and very dangerous, as far as shaming yourself without, like, unnecessarily, because then you are guilty, and you start to become almost angry at your spouse, and they're like, what did I do? And that's a whole nother topic. But it is important to understand that, going back to just like your self-identity, you need to create this realistic picture of your identity that's surrounded by things you can control.
Mm-hmm.
You shouldn't be focused on those things that are, like, if you are infertile, that is hard, but you do have other abilities. You can focus on those and strengthen those. You can strengthen your relationship with your spouse, or you can strengthen your relationship with your family. And you can even be a parent to other people. I know I had a teacher in high school who, he was like the most fatherly, like, so super welcoming, and just like, he would just hug you, and he would just love you, and he was so uplifting. And he and his wife couldn't have kids, and I think they were too old to adopt, or they weren't able to adopt. And it was just really hard. Like, they weren't really able to have the family that they had ideally pictured, but they worked so hard to be a parent to other children. And especially kids in high school, there's some kids in high school that they have parents, but the parents are not good at parenting. So it's important to have those parental figures that are good, and that are kind and loving, that are, even outside the home. So that can be a new identity that you create, and that you get to build yourself, and think about, okay, if I was a kid that didn't have great parents, like, how would I want someone to treat me? And that's how I can treat other people that need it, kind of this very charitable aspect that you can totally build, and it's super healthy. And it's good both ways. It's good for you, and it's good for the other people that you show love to.
Yeah. I think depending on your culture and what you grew up with in your dreams, you might have this idea and this meaning associated with being a wife, and I think a lot of the time people associate wife with mother, and being a mom means having your own children and raising your own children. But if you can change that meaning of infertility and that meaning of mother to raising other kids, or raising those around you and being an example to those around you, I think you can help your journey through grief. You can kind of overcome that grieving feeling, and recognize that your identity and your purpose is not just having kids. Mm-hmm. Your purpose is so much more, whether that's teaching other people how to swim, or teaching or talking to other people through their feelings, or helping them with finances, or whatever, whatever hobbies you have, whatever strengths you have, that is your identity. You know, you don't have to place your entire worth onto something that you can't do, because eventually that will just lead you down a hole, that will lead you down a dark path that you won't be able to get out of, because all you're focusing now on is something that you can't do. Focus on those things that you can do. Focus on the things that create who you are, that aren't just those bad things. Yes, we make mistakes sometimes, and infertility has nothing to do with mistakes. Infertility has something that you can't control. So focus on those things that you can't control, like Megan was explaining.
And I think it's important to, obviously, those that are struggling, I think, with infertility or miscarriage are usually those that are either in a very serious relationship or married. And that can be difficult when you have this picture of your self-identity and you're trying to work on changing it, and then your partner is doing the same thing, but it can look very different. You can live the same home, have very similar values, but you are two different people. And the only way to make a baby is a man and a woman. And it's always going to be different. So, some statistics that we found between men and women. This is from some research done by McCrite. And it says men and women tend to differ in how they express their grief and the coping strategies they use. The women often expressing their grief more openly. With women often expressing their grief more openly and seeking out social support, while men often grieve more internally and use more avoidance coping strategies. So, you can see how this would be very difficult if the woman is constantly trying to talk to her husband or her boyfriend and is like, I just want to talk, like, get my feelings out, like, I'm struggling, this hurts, like, let me hurt for a little bit. And he's just like, no, I don't want to talk about it, like, this hurts me too, let's do something else, let's go do something else, like, I just don't even want to think about it. And so these two very different coping strategies can be very difficult to work with,
which is called incongruent grieving. And so when couples do experience incongruent grieving, it does cause a lot of tension and a lot of conflict, a lot of contention in the home, and you don't necessarily want it to be contentious. You don't want your home to be contentious. You guys want to be bonded, but unfortunately men and women just experience coping strategies differently. It's just how you go about that really determines basically your journey together through this infertility experience. And something that I found interesting was that women who use social support to grieve, they might experience or might go through the grieving process faster, quicker, in more healthier ways. But for men who go through social support for grieving, they actually experience more depression. And so it's important as a wife and as a husband to recognize that you do grieve differently and you respect each other's differences. Because if you don't respect those differences, it's going to be a lot harder for you both to bond and, go through this process together than it normally would be.
Yeah, because it can be really beneficial once you do figure out, okay, he just doesn't want to talk right now. Okay, that's fine. Like, I can call up somebody else and talk about this, and not like to diss on your husband, but like you can have other healthy relationships where maybe you talk to a therapist and you're like, hey, I just need to talk about how much this is hurting me, because it is hurting me. Or maybe you do have like a mom or a friend, someone that you can be like, let me just vent this out for a little bit so I don't hurt my significant other anymore. He needs to grieve in the way that he needs to grieve, and I want to support him in doing so, and vice versa. Like, maybe the husband just needs to get away and be like, hey, I know you're hurting, Like, and I want you to go hang out with your friends and talk about it and cry and watch a sad movie and eat ice cream, and I support you in that. But I'm gonna go play video games because I just cannot. I can't right now. So
Yeah.
and it's important to really figure out how to work in a healthy way so that you can have a healthy relationship. So.
Right. Yeah. It's important that you don't pull away from each other, but instead come together in your differences. And that is a healthy coping mechanism. So if you are going through something like this, please reflect on your relationship, see what you both can do to better your relationship, how you can both communicate with each other, not necessarily grieve the same way, but talk through those grieving and coping mechanisms that you are more likely to gravitate towards.
These were just some interesting finds in the research that we did. One was from, it says, although individual coping is important, research indicates that dyadic coping, a process in which both partners are mutually engaged in coping, is a stronger predictor of relationship functioning than individual coping, and also is positively correlated with relationship satisfaction, which is kind of what we just talked about, where your relationship can be stronger. It will be hard and it won't be easier, but your relationship can be stronger. Some other research said, while the research cited above often highlights the distress caused by infertility, more optimistic results have been identified. Women have found ways of building life satisfaction that include investment in their own hobbies, work, relationships, taking interest in their children, of relatives and friends. A long-term study with infertile couples identified the reconstruction of a positive sense of self and finding meaning in life without children as part of the adaptation to childlessness.
And we kind of talked about that, how we just need to find different meanings in infertility and different meanings in our strengths so that we can have a better positive mindset and perspective. Not saying that you need to push away those grieving feelings, but hopefully changing or looking at your situation in a different light can help you move past those feelings of depression and those feelings of sadness and stress. So yeah, and we kind of learned how to experience greater closeness and strength in relationships after miscarriages within a relationship, and that can include open communication, acceptance of differences in grieving, and supportive behaviors. So spending time together, efforts to care for each other, and which we literally already just talked about. But that just describes the importance of having open communication, the importance of accepting the differences in grieving and coping, and supporting each other through these hard times.
And I think it's important to note that these are things that you can work on now. Like it doesn't have to be like, oh, when I'm diagnosed with infertility,
right,
or when I get married. You know, like these are things, like, try to practice open communication within your own family or within other relationships. You know, practice acceptance of differences in grieving, or just accepting differences in general, and use supportive behaviors in doing so.
Yeah.
Like, you can be supportive of someone without having to, you know, compromise your own standards. Like, you can still have your own standards and your own boundaries when it comes to grieving or just having these big feelings. You can still have boundaries, and you can still support someone else with their boundaries and their grieving processes.
Right. And I think it's hard for at least women to be like, why isn't my husband talking to me about this? Like, this is something that we should be communicating together, because this isn't just me. This is us, you know, this is affecting both of us. So why isn't he talking to me as much? It's hard, you know?
Yes.
But as women, we need to recognize our husbands or our boyfriends or serious boyfriends are experiencing it just in a completely different way. So as hard as it is, you have to take yourself out of that out of your own perspective and see things from his perspective. You know, he's also experiencing pain. He is also experiencing that loss that you both are experiencing. You know, it's just, yeah, you just have to see it.
It's very real on both sides, and it's very hard on both sides. And you can't escape that. Like, it's grief, and it is good to grieve. That's the whole reason for this podcast. But it is hard, and it's not easier the more that you grieve. I wish it was, but it does build your own emotional resiliency. You do become stronger as you continue to practice these coping mechanisms and these different perspectives. You just become you have a stronger self-identity. You have a stronger presence just within your own community as you go through this trial with grace.
Yeah. It's important that you move through the grieving, but don't sit in it. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a difference between experiencing the grief and thinking, oh, it's good for me to grieve. It's okay that I can be like this forever. You know, you have to recognize that it is okay to grieve, but that shouldn't stop your entire way of living. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we made this podcast, so that you can understand that what you are feeling is totally valid. What you are feeling is normal, but we have resources that can help you through that process and through those trials that you go through, such as infertility and miscarriages. Yeah. Speaking of which, we have linked down some resources below that you can click on if you are experiencing those struggles with infertility. But
we also added some other just procreative grief resources, because we do know that there's grief as far as like grief when you have to give up your child for adoption. That is the loss that needs to be grieved. Or if you do choose to have an abortion, there is grief attached to that. Or if you have a hysterectomy, that can be a grieving process in and of itself. And so we've attached some other resources that all kind of tie to this topic of infertility, miscarriage, just procreative grief. And we hope that you use these resources, and we hope that you take the time to understand and give whatever you're feeling a name, so that it takes that power and weight off of you. Because it can do a lot when you recognize, okay, you know what, I am grieving today. Like, I realize and recognize that I just need to grieve, and it's okay. Like, I can grieve, and I am capable of grieving, and I'm going to eat some ice cream to help me grieve, or I'm going to go talk to someone, or I'm going to go for a walk. But recognizing it is the first step. We hope that you'll leave comments down below. We want to hear about your personal stories.
What did you learn? You know, what is something that you applied to your life, or something that you will be applying to your life? Any feedback we would love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, like, help us better understand the different aspects of what infertility looks like, or even other procreative grieving aspects that maybe we didn't talk about. We'd love to hear about it, and we'd love to hear your grieving process. We want to make this normal and a comfortable topic, and normalize this conversation.
With that being said, thank you for listening to Good Grief, and we'll see you in our next episode.
Bye.
Bye.